Good morning and welcome to this very interesting session on boards and CEOs, hiring, development, and firing, the whole cycle in the life of a CEO. And as we know, the mission of IESE is to develop leaders who would like to make a positive impact in society. We've discussed a lot about the positive impact in the prior session. Let's look at how development works. And to discuss this, we have two excellent views from experts in different fields. First off, Professor Herminia Ibarra from the London Business School and Professor Mireia Giné from our very own IESE. I know that they need no introduction, but as you can expect, I'm going to introduce them regardless, even if briefly, and you could find a lot more about their very rich careers naturally on the web. But allow me to at least highlight some of the aspects that bring us together in this session so we can appreciate the wealth of data and knowledge that they are going to share with us this morning. So Herminia Ibarra is the Charles Handy Professor of Organizational Behavior at the London Business School. Prior to LBS, she served on the Harvard Business School and at INSEAD, where I had the privilege to actually be next door to her and benefit from her mentorship. And actually, it was the time when you wrote the book, or initial stages of one of the books that you will discuss today as well. Think as a leader, act as a leader.
The other way around.
Exactly. I knew I was confused as I was saying it. And the prior book on working identities, which I think is one of the most helpful books for my leadership classes. Across the board, I've used it in California, I've used it in INSEAD, I've used it at IESE, and it is very helpful to executives and students in the MBA programs across the board, together with the article on What's Your Story? I cannot even name how many times I've advised it to people and they found it very, very helpful. So you know a thing or two about developing leaders, I think. And obviously, other people also know. Herminia got a PhD at Yale, and obviously she speaks in numerous settings, TEDx. She ranks among the Thinkers 50 among management scholars, and has been invited to speak in numerous universities. I think without further ado, we will switch to Mireia Giné, who, as I have mentioned, is a professor in the Department of Financial Management at IESE. She earned her degrees at Pompeu Fabra University and a PhD at the University of Barcelona. And prior to coming to IESE, she actually worked at the Wharton School, actually in her entrepreneurial version. She is being really helpful to numerous scholars, 500 institutions, by developing a rich data set on all management issues called WORDS. You many are familiar with it, the Wharton Research Data Services, for which she's still leading the international operations and business developing in EMEA. She also serves as an independent board member in Bank Sabadell and is a member of their compensation committee, as well as a member of the board in the Financial Consumer Services Unit. And obviously, she has published quite a bit in the top finance journals on corporate governance, mergers and acquisitions, and AI. And perhaps one way of describing how the discipline to do all this happens is because of your sports training, having been in the national team for the modern pentathlon. So we have two great perspectives, first from the leadership, then from the corporate finance view on CEOs. Let's hear about how to develop CEOs. Thank you, Herminia.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Herminia. And I'm going to talk about an article that I wrote recently with two colleagues from the headhunter firm Spencer Stuart in the Harvard Business Review, looking at how CEO and C-suite candidates developed the skills or demonstrated the skills that would get them hired into the role and allow them to perform in those roles. And I come at it, my field's organizational behavior. What I have studied for a big part of my career is how people make transitions into roles that not only require a different skill set, but also require them to use less a skill set that has become a part of their sense of identity, which is always the biggest impediment to doing the things that we all know we need to do when we move into different roles. Now, part of what inspired this is, and you must have noticed it as well, all of a sudden, we have been talking a lot about soft skills or people skills, and I think the pandemic really exacerbated that. Everywhere you look, there's talk about it, and I have to say that one of the things that annoyed me slightly was an article about this very topic, claiming to have lots of evidence about it, in which the evidence was, also from search firms, the fact that soft skills were mentioned much more in mandates, in job descriptions, in searches. What you see here is a graph from that study, and it's looking at the change relative to the year 2000 in the extent to which these social, people, or so-called soft skills are being mentioned relative to financial and so-called harder skills. And so a lot of talk about this, and I really wanted to find some data. Is there any data that we can use to address this? And that was the result of trying to take a closer look with some data from Spencer Stuart. And so we had 3 questions. What are these skills? Because these are terms that get thrown around a lot without necessarily being very specific about what are these human capacities that are supposed to be so important now. What are they? Do they matter in succession, and do they matter in CEO performance? And then how do executives develop them? And that's the part that I'm most interested in, the journey towards changing in a way that's actually fairly fundamental. So those are the 3 things I'll talk about. In terms of what they are, one of the things that we notice very immediately is that there has been a very heavy focus, without empirical work to go with it, around interpersonal skills. Listening, asking good questions, having empathy, connecting with people, the more interpersonal kinds of skills. In this basket, there really isn't any research in it in my field, but when you look at practice, one of the things I've been doing over the past 10 years or so is looking at organizations in the process of transforming, first in the context of digital transformation, but more recently in the context of everything. You know, it's the world, ESG, artificial intelligence. And a lot of organizations have switched to a model of leadership development and training that emphasizes coaching skills, asking good questions. The idea being that we're now in an environment in which you really have to help people develop themselves. You're not going to have the answers as a leader, and so the better you get at pulling out of them what they know, they're more able to act with autonomy. The organization can be more nimble. You don't have to have so much process because people know what to do. They are encouraged and empowered, and so the role of the manager becomes more of a coach. It's still relatively new. I'll give you an example. When I teach senior executives, I always ask them about how they spend their time and what do they spend too much time on and what do they spend not enough time on. And over the years, strategizing was always the thing, I don't do enough of this, the operational demands take up all of my time. Over the last 5 years, what's coming up as much and as often is coaching and developing people. They're aware they need to be doing it. That's out there, but they're not doing it. So that's the first basket. But as we were reviewing the literature and also talking about it within the context of the search firm, what do you look at? There are other skills that are more systemic, that we don't pay as much attention to, and that are also vital. A second one has to do with your ability to collaborate across networks, across areas. You know, think about a top leadership team, they have to be able to collaborate with their counterparts in different areas, heading different business units. They have to be able to work through networks. And that's another area that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years, particularly thanks to the work of my colleague Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School, who has done a ton of work on psychological safety. And the importance of being able to speak up, but also to make mistakes in a context in which it's not just about execution, it's also about innovation, in a context in which leaders have to go into areas where they're not as skilled, there's more uncertainty, there's more scope for learning that is possibly making mistakes. So there's a whole set of skills having to do with how do you create a context in which there's enough safety for people to speak out and say, I disagree. I don't think we're going to be able to meet that deadline. There's this issue we haven't considered, in contexts where in the past silence really has been the default. So that's the second basket. And the third basket, also an area in which there's not a lot of empirical research, but when you do an in-depth look at any organization in the context of transforming, you see its importance, and that is how do you shape a culture? How do you transform a culture? Because restructuring is never enough. You have to get people to be able to behave differently. And how is it that people develop the skills not just at the level of one-on-one interactions, but being able to see what is the system? What is it rewarding? What is it impeding? What are the obstacles? And how do we shape that culture so that people can be more innovative, more risk-taking, more learning-oriented, all of those things. So those were the three baskets that we started to look at and to pay attention to. And in particularly very much interested in this idea of culture shaping and aligning. We just see so much evidence of the kinds of obstacles that are there that get in the way of this kind of transformation, but that we don't pay attention to. I'll give you an example. And this comes from one of the top executives at Microsoft during the time of its big transformation under Satya Nadella towards a more learning-oriented culture. He was the head of sales and marketing, very successful, but very much an old-style manager, very directive, very much by the KPIs, not particularly empathetic, kind of went on a learning journey. But one of the most important things that he did to help transform that company was to understand that the way that they did quarterly business review had become not just a fundamental impediment to the transformation, but was completely giving the opposite message to everything that they were trying to do. That what they were trying to do is more customer orientation obsession and also less time on internal political corporate theater and more time on real work. And they had a way of doing quarterly business review in which people spent months preparing 100 slides, a lot of show, a lot of meetings before the meetings. The one in February ruined everybody's Christmas holiday. And that was 2 months spent on internal process that you were not spending with customers. And the way they did it, it was a test, it was a show, it was backwards looking, it was not a context in which you were going to discuss what you had learned, what was not working. It did not promote learning, the thing that they were trying to do, and so they eliminated it, or they streamlined it quite a bit. Anyway, just a flavor of the kinds of things we were looking at. In terms of our data, we had a data set of 75 CEO successions, 235 candidates, internal and external, large cap, US and Europe, from 2009 to 2019. Now, once we whittled it down to the ones that we actually had performance data for, that was down to only 47, but we were able to get shareholder return, revenue growth, operating margins. And then with a smaller sample, we did some pretty in-depth interviews and also relied on the extensive assessment and development data that Spencer Stuart had on these candidates. So those are our data. Who succeeds? The fact is that really delivering results was the only big predictor or correlate of who succeeds. There was an effect for collaborating and influencing, and there was also an effect for what they call self-evaluation and adjustment, which is kind of ability to learn. But the big factor really was delivering results. And the other thing that we didn't completely play up in the article, but was there, was that for all of these candidates, there were large developmental opportunities or developmental gaps in terms of these important people skills. And so it raises the interesting question of how do you develop those things when you're in the limelight, when the stakes are so high? But anyway, delivering results was really the biggest driver of do you get the job? And then when we looked at success as a CEO in terms of 2 and 3 years out, the collaborating and influencing and self-evaluation and adjustment were the biggest factors, okay? Were the biggest factors. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what were the non-correlates because Spencer Stuart did not want to divulge all of the different aspects that they measure and assess, but these were the strong factors. So then we wanted to look at how do people develop them? How do people develop them? And what we saw was a somewhat extended learning journey. You know, it's not like the clouds part and you kind of know I've got to change and I've got to become more people-centric. It's a bit of a messy journey that takes a while, in which we take a step forward and we take a step back. And so I want to talk about each of these parts, and then we can turn to a discussion. So the departure is when people actually become aware, not that they have a gap or not that they lack a skill. It's when they become aware that it's a real problem. They become aware that it's going to get in the way of something that really matters to them. Because in psychology, we have this notion of, it's called positive illusion. And positive illusion is you see yourself in the best light possible. So you might know that you're not a good listener. Or you probably do know, because people tell you you're not a good listener. Or you might know that you're a bit controlling. But you see that as part of your secret sauce, part of what makes you fantastic. It's about the energy and the drive that you bring to the job. And so it takes a while. There's not a single aha. There's lots of moments where you didn't accomplish something you wanted, where you got feedback, where you put the pieces together, and you start to realize that not developing some of these skills is going to really get in the way of something that matters to you. And most people going into this, they don't realize the extent of what's involved. They do think, I just need to be a better listener. I need to ask better questions. Don't understand the extent to which their behavior is getting in the way of really being able to bring other people along and have these collaborative conversations. The voyage is the whole transition mess, and that is a time in which we're learning. You're putting one foot forward, and then you have a deadline, and you revert back to the old ways of doing things, which is what happens very, very typically. We notice 3 things that make a difference. The first one, creating a new context for learning. These executives find it very difficult to change from one day to the next in the context of their immediate role in their immediate team. And so one of the things that we noticed made a big difference is being able to learn these skills in a different context. So for people who've been quite operational and quite directive, for example, being on a board was very helpful because that was a context in which they had a more complex stakeholder situation, in which they had to exercise influence without authority, in which they had to ask more than tell. And so contexts like this would create a context in which you could practice and see these skills in operation and then start to transfer them more into your day-to-day. That made a difference. Enlisting helpers makes a huge difference. Almost all these people had external coaches. This has become a huge industry. But that's not enough, because your external coach is not there actually seeing what's going on. One of the biggest factors in whether we change is whether you're able to enlist the help of others, maybe your colleagues on your top team. Somebody who can see you in operation and who has been given license to say, hey, you said you're going to talk less, but you're not. And really keep you at it. It makes a big difference. Now, a lot of times leaders ask for it, but they don't get it because nobody believes that they actually want to change or that they actually want to get that feedback. So it can be quite a process of starting to build up enough of a sense of safety where people actually have the guts to come to you. Reed Hastings of Netflix tells some funny stories about this because apparently he's quite an overbearing leader. And so one of the things that he does, he tries to encourage people to give him negative feedback because they've had some very public screw-ups where he's had a fantastic strategy idea that ends up costing them, millions in subscribers because people haven't dared to say that's a bad idea. So he has things like this idea of, what does he call it? It's... he has a word for it, where if somebody gives him negative feedback, he'll get close to them and have kind of like nonverbal signals of acceptance to be a little bit less scary. But there's a whole bunch of work around if you really do want to enlist helpers. And then, of course, we all have setbacks. And sticking through them and using them not as examples of I'm never going to be this way, but as examples of learning and shedding light on those moments when it is going to be more difficult to be exercising these skills. Okay, and the return. So what's the return? We're using the hero's journey here as a bit of a metaphor. What's the return? The return is when you've really changed. And what we see here with these executives is a shift from I should be a better listener to, this could have promise. This could be a good way of operating, all the way to this is who I am and who I want to become. So it's an identity transformation. They come to see it as a genuine reflection of themselves. They become better situational leaders because this is not all about always using a more empowering people-centric style. Sometimes that's not it. But ironically, some of these leaders, as they got better at the softer side of things, also got better about when not to use that style. And importantly, what we saw in a lot of examples is you're kind of the converted, and so you want to propagate it. You want to share, you want to amplify, you want to put practices in place in your organization that allow more of this to flourish. So one example is the one I gave you about the person who ended up transforming how they did quarterly business review. There was another person in one of our studies who simply headed capital markets for his law firm, but had become so frustrated at how much time they were spending in what they call calibration meetings, where it's as part of the performance assessment process. Once everybody's been assessed in their units, you have to compare and kind of rank order everybody. And he had calculated the cost of this, which was extravagant, and the low learning that was coming out of it, and worked with his organization to transform it so that they put in something that was more developmental of kind of people coming up. So those are some examples of that. Now, in my study, the implications were more for individuals. So I try to think about what might be some implications either for the organization or for boards, but you're going to have to tell me more about that. Part of it is understanding that this takes a long time. And so, because part of what happens in a succession context, these are people who are smart, they get it, they can look empowering for the short enough time that this is going on, but it's not anchored yet. It's not real yet. It takes a while. The context for learning is really important. Are there assignments, task forces, external boards, things in which people can practice in a more low-cost way and really come to understand what these skills are? Because what people would tell us is, I didn't really understand what this empowering thing was until I got better at it, until I failed to do it, and then until I got better at it. So trying to figure out what are those contexts for learning, what are the assignments that are really going to develop people. The classic thing has always been, put somebody in a non-P&L role, so they have to exercise influence without authority, but we need to think about what those are. Promote helping relationships. One of the things that I have studied a lot over the years is mentoring and sponsorship. So how do you help people develop into the most senior roles? Well, I work a lot with sponsors of high potential leaders, and the sponsors are terrible at it. In fact, you've got to tell them exactly what to do. They're not naturally paying attention to that, and so promoting that helps. And then in terms of what you're looking for, don't just look for the interpersonal skills, and I know you're going to talk about this, but also look for the ability to work through networks and to act systemically, because I think today in most organizations, the name of the game is being able to shape a culture, to transform a culture, to create a culture, and that's a toughie. It's not anything that you can do directly. But being able to understand that, I think, is a very vital skill in this era of vast need for transformation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Herminia. Okay.
Thank you, Herminia. It's a pleasure to listen to your insights on the Leadership Odyssey. And thank you for the invitation to contribute to, let's see if I have my slides, to contribute from a corporate finance perspective on this topic of CEO hiring and retention. So what I would like to cover over the next 20 minutes is that, of course, from a corporate finance perspective, what do we tend to overemphasize? And it's performance, right? And what we tend as well to overemphasize is this method: how can we quantify whether CEO behaviors and abilities correlate or causally improve this performance? So what I would like to cover is first show you how the market for CEO is a peculiar one, then show you how CEO behavior and abilities correlates or is causally linked to performance, and then finish with a few insights on CEO pay. So one of the most important decisions a board has to take, of course, is to find and first select and find that best fit CEO. That is a very costly process. It is not, this market for CEOs is not a competitive market. It requires a very elaborate and costly process to find that gem. And in spite of this very elaborate process that some of you in the audience have experienced, 80% of new CEOs in large corporations come from inside, are internal candidates. Only 3% of the CEOs that are newly appointed are completely new. So this is telling us, this might be some evidence that the hiring of new CEOs is determined highly by company-specific characteristics, both from a human capital perspective and firm characteristics, together with network connections. Now, if I could give you a different perspective, maybe as well there could be some inefficiencies here, right? And to benchmark that, we could look at how PE firms hire their CEOs. And for that, we observe that 75 of those CEOs come from outside, right? Okay, so before we go into the hiring process, let me show you how the market for CEOs looks today, okay? So from a tenure perspective, both in the US and in Europe, an average CEO stays around 5 years, sorry, not 5 days, 5 years in the position. So yes, there is rotation. The average age is mid-50s, late 50s. Profiles have been moving from more industry-specific to more general and transferable. This means that those CEOs have been moving across industries, have had different positions, have worked for conglomerates. Networks matter. In which way? Well, 70% of CEOs in the S&P 500 have an MBA, and if you come from a top program, then it's 5 times more likely that you end up with a CEO position. Military background, this is very interesting. This applies to the US. 60% of CEOs in the US had a military background, had been deployed to war. Now it's 15. Yeah? It's not a small number. And 54 have an engineering background. In terms of gender, both the picture here, both in the US and in Europe, is the same. 90% men, 10% women. We will talk more about that. Race, clearly, mostly Caucasians. And in terms of pay, of course, we are all very aware that pay it's continued to rise, and it continued to detach CEOs from the next C-suite executives and from workers. And here what we observe is what I call here the abnormal pay. What do we call by abnormal pay? Is this pay once we have already accounted for the size, the industry, and other characteristics. And what we observe is that when you hire an internal candidate, you tend to pay approximately $500,000. When you hire an outsider, you pay 5.3 million, right? So they are much more expensive. One potential explanation could be that those outsiders are generalists. And we have observed that generalists have a premium, 20% of pay, right? So this is quite remarkable. Okay, so our first question, does the identity of CEOs matter for performance, right? It could be the case that better firms have better processes, and in fact, it's not that important to have that single and that unique CEO. So a first approach to address this is to look at what do CEOs do. And there is a large historic tradition in corporate finance to go and do inside, well, not from corporate finance, from the leadership field to do very inside interviews. What the field of corporate finance has brought here is to scale this up, to scale this shadowing approach and get very detailed information on what CEOs do on a daily basis. I'd like to highlight here Bandiera et al. Research, and essentially once they gather all these massive amounts of data, they pass it through a machine learning algorithm, which, as we say, it's agnostic, and therefore it's going to tell us how many distinct behaviors do we observe in this very large set of CEOs, which is 1,100 CEOs across six countries. And what's very interesting is now that we have this heterogeneity of behavior, how does this correlate with performance? And I'm going to show you how does this look like. Before, let me give you some color on what is the activity. And it's very quotidian activity. It's, okay, so the average CEO spends most of his time in meetings. 1/3 is with one person, 2/3 with more than one person. Most of them are planned, some with insiders, with outsiders. 25% of the working time is alone, preparing, writing emails, etc. 10% of the time personal matters, and 8% traveling. But what's interesting in this graph is to see how the boxes show that there is a lot of heterogeneity. So in particular, for example, in meetings and in working alone, the box will show us the interquartile range, so 50% of the distribution is going to be there, and the extremes is going to show us the maximum and the minimum. And we see that there is a lot of heterogeneity in this behavior. What's really interesting is now we have all of these factors, and you can see in the column on the left, planned visits, just outsiders, production, suppliers. What do you think that this behavior correlates with? Managerial behavior. CEOs that have a very focused on management and operations. On the right-hand side, what we have is communications, outside, connecting with outsiders, insiders, C-suite, and multifunction. And as you have guessed, of course, this is much more of a leadership style. So if I had to succinctly synthesize what is management style, is setting up systems to ensure that plans are implemented. Leadership style, it's about what Herminia was talking about, organizational alignment. Okay, so now that we have these behaviors, and in fact, this study doesn't say that there are just two types. It says that CEOs can move in this index, can be a little bit more on the leadership side or on the management side. And now we're talking here about causality. When we appoint a new CEO, what do we see that happens to performance 3 years later? And what the study tells us is that CEOs that lean more to the leadership style tend to generate these positive returns on performance. And of course, now all of you must be thinking, okay, we just need to get leaders, right? As CEOs, like what are we doing with the management CEOs? But of course, it's not such a simple story. We could have different needs across organizations, and this is what we call, horizontal differentiation. So some firms would match better with management style CEOs versus some other firms that would benefit much more with leadership style. And what A set of research tells us, and this is not just one particular article, but really a set of research, is that the match is fundamental. That the effect on performance is finding that good match, is not just the characteristics itself of the CEO. And what this study tells us as well, and I find that very, very interesting, is that we could estimate that there is at least 20% of mismatch of firms that have leaders and should have managers, and firms that have managers and should have more of the leadership style. And here we could talk about two types of frictions. We could talk about frictions in the labor market. So in some geographies, it's very hard to find that good CEO, right? So you go for a type of a second best. But as well, I'd like to connect this with what Herminia has told us, right? This journey of the leaders that have to adapt themselves. So we have seen that these CEOs are coming from the C-suite, how they adapt themselves to these new positions. So these are more of these internal frictions. Now, I'd like to talk about how do we map these behaviors to abilities. Can the abilities of the CEO be very distinct and be very distinct from other C-suite executives? And here's when we can use the approach of large data. And I'd like to cite here the research of Kaplan and Sorensen, which what they do is they scale up massively these assessments that recruiters do, and they cover 2,600 executives, right? They go through, and here in the audience we have many of you that work in the industry. You do in-depth interviews, right? 20 pages reports. You do all these tests. So essentially, we have this wealth of data. And this data that covers leadership, personal, intellectual motivation, and then we ask ourselves, okay, can we synthesize this in a way that is, interpretable? And as well, could that be predictable as well? Could that tell us who are going to be the next CEOs? Okay, so before I tell you what are these 4 features, let me show you, and probably all of you are very much this list of abilities, of core abilities. So the ones that I'm highlighting: hires A players, develops people, removes underperformance. These are very much connected to leadership. And here, listening skills that we have talked about, open to criticism, oral communication, teamwork. These are more associated with interpersonal. Now, I'm going to show you how these core abilities map for the CEOs versus other executives. And there are some surprising results here. Okay, so the first 2 factors are what we call general ability, which is going to be talent, and the second one is execution. Okay, vertical line, general talent, horizontal execution, and on the other side, interpersonal. The data is telling us that there is a tension. Yes, there is a tension between being more on the execution side or being more on the interpersonal, more on the consensus-driven. And what we observe is that the space of the CEO, look at the space of the CEO versus the space of the CFO, they're very, very distinct. So CEOs rank very high on general ability, on talent, and very high on execution, versus CFOs in this sample, and this is a very large sample, tend to score much more on the interpersonal and have lower lower general ability. These arrows show us the initial position are those candidates that were interviewed or assessed for the position, and the arrow points to the final candidates, right? So what we observe is that the CEOs really tilted towards not so much execution and a little bit of interpersonal, So interpersonal matters. Okay, let's go to the second 2 other factors. Execution is associated with fast, high standards, proactive, holds people accountable. Interpersonal is associated with teamwork, listening skills, open to criticism, and persuasion, and building consensus. Okay, the other 2 factors. Again, I'm going to show you the same graph. So on the vertical line, creative and strategic, those 2 things go together, believe it or not, and charismatic, okay? So what we see, again, is that the CEO is very high on strategic focus and creative and very charismatic, and CFOs, just to make sure that we have here this message of being very differential, are on the analytical side and attention to detail. What do we mean by charismatic? Of course, this is a very, it's hard to define, but here in these type of studies, is correlated with enthusiasm, persuasion, being proactive, and taking fast decisions. Okay, so, what do we seem to have agreed? Is that CEOs are peculiar. CEOs have abilities that are very differential from other chief executives, so from other C-suite executives. They have much more general ability, greater execution, great charisma, and have a strong strategic perspective. What's very interesting is that these factors predict who will be hired as a CEO. And therefore, in a certain way, you can modulate your abilities, right? As we have heard from Herminia, yeah? You can work on your abilities, your talents to move towards this space. And interestingly, we have to ask ourselves, okay, so at the end of the day, who gets hired? What are the features that will predict who gets hired? And what we tend to agree this is in several studies, is that greater ability and interpersonal skills are more likely, those candidates are more likely to get hired. However, and this is a big discussion, there's still room, for further analysis here, it seems to be that interpersonal skills are unrelated to performance. So performance is much more related to general ability, to execution, than to interpersonal skills. What we observe as well in the data is that boards tend to overweight interpersonal skills at the expense of execution. So this is just pointing towards one of the potential biases in hiring. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I'd like to talk a little bit about setting the right pay for hiring CEOs. And of course, we are very much aware of this increase in CEO pay and this detachment of CEO pay versus other executives. And I'd like to point towards three factors. There are many factors, but three factors that pertain to our discussion today. And the first one is technological change. So technological change is associated with pay increases gaps. And why is the case? Well, when there is rapid technological change, and we certainly are living through one of these moments, companies are willing to pay for those CEOs that have the ability to recognize and invest in new technology under uncertainty. Yeah? And that is a very peculiar talent. So in these moments where there is a lot of innovation and together with a lot of uncertainty, finding those CEOs will deliver higher gaps between those CEOs and the C-suite. And as an example, we could name, for example, Toyota choosing to develop Prius just as electric batteries became efficient, right? They were the first movers, and it required a certain type of CEO to make that decision. The second aspect that I would like to highlight is this interaction between board members and shareholders and investors. Board members, they define the pay, they set the pay, but then investors have to approve it, right? They have to vote for it. And one question is, how much voice do we give to shareholders? Should we try to minimize getting their input and avoid conflict here, or managing, as we have heard in the prior session with activists? Yeah, it's hard to manage. What we tend to observe in several analyses is that, in fact, engaging with investors and having them to say something about your compensation really unlocks value. It unlocks value from a market cap perspective, as well as long-term profits. And the reason being is that asking for opinions to the shareholders seems to be a very strong disciplining effect. Yeah? And that seems to be something very good for corporations. The third element that I would like to highlight is the structure of pay. This very important discussion about how do we set incentives so that those incentives are aligned to performance. And what we can say from our research is that, in fact, setting up these incentives does change with the context. So if we have contexts that are less prone to competition, we are going to have softer incentives. And in fact, board members have to be very much aware of how those incentives are, set and adapt to the competitive landscape. And board members have, and in particular, the compensation committee can have a lot to say on how to set those incentives right. So, in sum, it seems to be that from the data we gather that CEOs tend to pivot between these two types of behaviors, more on the management or the leadership side. We can attest that what's important is the match. Most value comes from this combination rather than the candidate on itself. That CEOs have distinct abilities, general ability, execution, charisma, and strategic perspective. We have to be aware of potential biases when selecting these CEOs. And finally, firms will pay for the ability to invest in new technology, namely AI or decarbonization, and boards need to interact with investors to unlock this value by this interaction and this disciplining effect. And I would like to set this discussion, final comment, this discussion in the context of the long-term horizon and thinking how corporations are in fact changing and responding to the needs of society, and how CEOs are going to be evolving accordingly. And I think that this is something that Herminia has shown us that this is possible. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much both for bringing in this wealth of qualitative and quantitative evidence about the relationship between CEO characteristics, firm outcomes, and outcomes for the CEOs as well. And I invite, by the way, if anybody has questions for the conversation, it's not just a conversation amongst us, but also with you. I have some of them, and they go along the lines of what was coming to mind at the beginning, which is, as markets evolve, as companies evolve in the new environment, what kinds of profiles do you think? How are they evolving? What are we looking for in terms of CEOs to be successful in leading constant transformation? And I know that you've done a lot of work on that. You also have looked at artificial intelligence, for example, and so some of the questions go along those lines. In this constant transformation environment, what is it that organizations are trying to look for? Or how to help organizations?
Well, I think the word you use is right, is transformation. I don't know any organization that is not trying to transform, to be more agile and more innovative and to use data and to deal with the climate change, all of these things, they're all trying to transform. And these are what, in my field, we call adaptive problems. They don't have easy solutions. You can't put in a plan that you're going to roll out over the next 7 years with the milestones because you don't know what's going to happen. And so you need people who are able to bring others along, because the characteristic of this problem is that they really require the effort of many. It's not like an answer that then you implement, and they require very deep transformation of the organization's systems and processes for doing things. They require transformation of the culture. And I mean, look at digital transformation. It has been very, very, very slow moving because the step between having a technology and being able to use it to its full potential is vast. And that requires changing behaviors and changing mindsets. And so leaders who are able to see the nature of the problem, to diagnose it, to understand what are the obstacles, what gets in the way, who are able to inspire people to behave differently when the incentives are not yet aligned, and to operate in that whole period when there is an alignment precisely, to be willing to learn, to be willing to try things that you haven't done before, to be willing to get out of your comfort zone. All of those things are these people's skills. And so I do think we will need them more. And it's a more nuanced view. It's not just you have to be a good listener. It's you have to be able to bring people with you and to capture their ideas and their commitment and collaboration in an effort to transform something that is completely misaligned in every possible way to what you now are trying to do.
Yeah, I couldn't be, more in agreement in terms of this importance of alignment. Yeah, when we think about, yes, transformation, so you're going to have to do two things, right? This alignment of the organization and finding the right investments, the physical part as well of the corporation. And if you wish, I can bring here a little bit from the finance point of view. There are a few examples of firms that have really morphed themselves, and one example that I really like is DSM, is the Dutch state mine, right? That started as very much a coal corporation, and that through a lot of vision and a series of interesting acquisitions has morphed into a life science corporation. And this is really a very unique example of how it takes, someone to have vision to say, okay, we're going to take that path, and slowly but surely we're going to get rid of some of our assets and incorporate some others that sort of make sense to our new vision for the firm, and that as well have some synergies with what we know what to do. Of course, this is one example, DSM. Another one you've mentioned is Microsoft. Yeah. Absolutely, right? So it takes some kind of CEO leadership to actually make that possible.
I think it's interesting to look at the disciplinary names we put to different skills, right? Because as I hear you speak about the vision, and I'm thinking execution requires to bring along that entire organization into mining, very complex, probably old company, right? And that persuasion to deal with both the board to follow that investment decision, the rest of the executives to come along. That negotiation and networking skills is hard to separate from how you implement that vision in order to adapt the company. It's very difficult to separate many times all these skills very clearly.
If I could add something about the difference between the board and the executive team, what we observe now is that boards are becoming much more specialized or with more specialized profiles. And I think that this is an interesting discussion that I've had with some of the members here in the audience, is whether boards should really have so much specialized knowledge or they should have more judgment, right? So boards should not overcompensate for the lackings of the chief for the C-suite, right? Boards should obviously be widely informed and know what they are talking about, but very importantly, exercise judgment and be able to have a value discussion, to provide that vision. They are not the ones to implement that.
So one of the issues that are coming up also in this changing environment and adaptation is obviously something you both have worked a lot, which is the social norms, how they evolve. And you pointed out, for example, and you've done it in a lot of your work also, the percentage of CEOs who are women is minimal. And so what can we do? What is it that both boards and CEOs themselves can do to prepare for this transition and transformation in organizations? So on the one hand, we can think of individual attributes. Are they different? Or is it the organizational side and even the search companies? Are they searching for a particular profile that fits the past, not the future? In terms of skills looked in the pool of available candidates? Or is it not just the demand, but also a supply? Are women sort of not leaning in, to use the terms? Is a combination of both, or how would you approach this difficult problem?
Herminia, you want me to go first? Right. So we've been grappling with this for a very long time.
I know.
The simplest answer is that something happens inside organizations that as people advance up the hierarchy, women are more likely to be in staff roles. So at entry levels, you have something close to 50-50 who is in operational P&L, kind of mission critical roles, and who is more in the support functions. But as you get, say, the layer below the C-suite, almost all of the women are in those roles that don't lead to the CEO role. And that has, we've had some pretty notable counterexamples, like, for example, Giné at IBM, she came out of sales, and that's where CEOs come out of. But you have had traditionally very few women promoted into those roles, given advice about moving into those roles, mentored into them, sponsored into them. And that continues to be a big problem. It's a smaller set than you might think if you just count the number of women at different levels in an organization.
How do you see it?
Yes, I would like just to focus on one thing, which is the promotion gap. I think that we should maybe put a pause on the discussion on abilities and so forth, and focus just on the promotion gap and ensuring that our corporations have the processes to promote talented women up the executive ladder. So what we observe not only in the executive world, but when I look into, for example, I've done research on the medical field, we observe the same pyramid, 50-50 at the beginning and then 90-10 at the top. So it's prevalent across, and I think that it really responds to not having yet those processes that ensure that women, talented women, can progress through the ladder. And here I think that human resources could improve as well their processes to maybe de-bias some of these processes, make them more open, have faster tracks for certain profiles. There are many things that can be done to work, and I would invite as well board members to actually review those policies in your corporations and see if, in fact, not only you have the policy, but whether the policy works. If through time you see that, yes, this is functioning, and in fact, 3 years later, not immediate, we need a period of adjustment, but 3 years later, we see advancement.
And to inform yourselves about where the biases are. So for example, there was a series of studies that came out of Yale showing there was also a big gap in terms of perceptions of potential. And what was interesting about the study is you had this gap. For the same level of performance, women would get lower assessments of potential, but over time that was the case. And so over time they kept outperforming, but still being rated less on potential, and it continued on. So it's a very strong bias, needing to understand what those are that are really limiting the pool. And then it goes both ways, because as a woman, when you see all of these limits, when you're getting inadequate feedback, when you're not being sponsored, at some point you just say, well, maybe I want to go and do something else. And then it becomes a supply problem.
And it becomes exactly what we are describing, right? The broken ladder. You were beginning on the ladder. It breaks potentially on both sides. So the biases can be on both sides, the demand and the supply. But attention to the pool of candidates, to the most diverse pool of candidates from the beginning. And in my own research, early promotion to the executive level ensures that people keeps progressing without the broken ranks. Okay, very interesting, thank you. We have plenty of questions. Let me take this one, which is also dear to my heart, which is how should a founder type of CEO behave with an interim CEO? What advice would we give in those roles? And it's not just in a founder, but it's typical also of many family businesses, right? Where if you don't have the founder, you still have a first generation or someone who hasn't let go. How to interact optimally to smooth the transition?
Difficult question. Difficult question. Yeah, because probably there's not one size fits all type of approach here. But yeah, I understand this moving away from an executive to a non-executive role, and that if I may do the parallelism as well, and with chairmen, for example, many chairmen have an executive role, and then governance is forced, upon that corporation, and they go into a less executive. Definitely, that would require, I would say, a hero path again. An odyssey is sort of examining how are you moving away from these day-to-day operations and having much more of an alignment role with the different stakeholders.
I think that that advice about listening and guiding with questions comes in very handy. Recently, one of my students I asked my students to interview CEOs, and one of them told them, you have to be more of an owl than a parrot. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good description.
More than a what?
An owl,
An
búho,
owl.
un búho. And I think that in a transition can potentially help a lot, right? Observing the situation, guiding with conversation, with questions, when the temptation would be to take on the reins again. Perhaps that's helpful. I don't know, I found it helpful. All right, so at the same time, people are wondering if you observe the assessments for the potential executives who are on the ranks. So you've shown some of the data on the tasks that CEO performs versus CFOs or CFOs. So for all of us, for both of you, thank you for the very insightful presentation, but how can the assessment on the part of companies or by boards change, say, after the pandemic or with the new requirements? Assessment processes in order to avoid biases.
In order to avoid biases.
Or to prepare for the future transition.
Yeah. These are different. So we can say that, yes, boards overemphasize this interpersonal element, or as well, for example, we've seen that VCs tend to provide more funding to teams that are positive, have high energy, or we tend to overemphasize just one metric, so sales growth. Yeah? And how do we debias? By taking a broad view on the problem. Yeah? By looking at it from many different perspectives and having internal views and external views. And I think that that is a way for debiasing progressively your decision.
Yeah. I think also not relying on one-size-fits-all assessment models, but really having a deep conversation about what's needed in this particular context. And honestly, often what's needed is everything, strategy and execution, this and that, we need a lot of things. But being able to understand, being able to have a very clear view of what's needed in that next leader is a very important part of it, I think.
So starting with assessing the organizational gaps.
Yeah.
You've worked quite a bit, and then moving on to the
What's the
profile.
challenge? What's the challenge ahead, and what is that going to require in terms of leadership?
So we have a question that was also in the back of my mind. Nobody, I think, or I missed it, spoke about fighting, the third part of the CEO transition. And there is a question about if you could walk us through some of the examples where perhaps a CEO was not able to change or adapt. And so what happens there? Do we have any data advice?
We have some examples, and I'd like to link that what in the prior session we've heard about activists. So activists, when you have an activist, the likelihood of the CEO getting fired is really high. And I can think of one very good example, which is Danone. And Danone was involved in a major environmental, especially environmental agenda. And Emmanuel Faber, right, moved the company to a very, I would say, to a very elaborate environmental plan. And then suddenly you had two activists that entered and said, okay, the corporation has some governance issues, but really what they wanted to do is to refocus the organization towards more of a profit, that had been a little bit put on the side. So about firing, so it's, it could be this tension with your shareholders when you have not communicated clearly what is your strategy, and then you can have like a coup happening to you, right? I would like to talk more about this than, if you are underperforming, so then the board takes the very difficult decision of, of finding a new match, right? But sometimes this threat comes from the outside. So again, the engagement with investors is fundamental to see what is their views on the CEO and whether the strategy is understood fully.
Yeah. So I think this is an area that's really understudied academically. But if I think about situations that I have seen close up, what I have seen most commonly is board chairs who protect underperforming CEOs for long periods of time and essentially become a barrier to information from the organization coming through. And that's worth thinking about. I've seen that more frequently than easy firing and when things are not working.
Yeah. And firing a CEO is a moment of truth for the boards, right? It's a moment where the board has to rise to the occasion. So if the governance of the board is poor, that transition is going to be complex and probably will destroy a lot of value. So it's a moment where, when you have this transition, the board has to excel. And for that, you already have to have done the homework. So you have to have a good operating board that has psychological safety, so everyone can speak up their mind. There is independence. Potentially the chairman is not overpowering, so that you have a distribution of power within the board, and that the committees can do their work as well. So in some cases, right, the nominating committee should have a succession plan. What do you do when you have this uncertainty and then suddenly you fire the CEO? You have no succession plan. That's...
And that would be one good, suggestion too, right? That is to have this wide pool of available candidates so that the succession plan is seen as natural, expected, smooth over when needed, but still, perhaps the most public examples of when firing doesn't work the way you've described is precisely conflict internally that sips over to the press, etc. There is one final question here, given the time we're, but I'm not familiar with this, but Intel used to have two-in-a-box approach with, for complex positions. Two individuals would share the position, one managerial, one leadership.
Co-CEOs.
Are you familiar with it? So co-CEOs is something I don't see as often, and it has to be managed very carefully. This idea seems to be complex positions, not just CEOs. Maybe somebody can clarify. I don't want to leave the question outside here. But
I mean, it was something you used to see a lot in the financial services sector. In investment banks, there was often that practice. And it often worked when there was a kind of like a growing up together, doing things jointly. It often worked less well when people got put together at a very senior level. But I haven't seen it in a very long time.
I see that's very exceptional as well. And that can lead to some coordination problems as well. And lack of clarity in who has here the leadership, the final vision.
And difficulty of the power of getting things done for the CEO, oftentimes, if those roles are not very clear. So my experience has been only transitional, but with a clear one at the end. Very good. Well, I think it's been a very interesting session. Thank you so much. It's hard to summarize all of the comprehensive view on CEO hiring, development, and even firing that we've learned now. But, I was taking note of at least 3 issues that I think give us food for thought to keep learning, and I really appreciate it. One is this, boards and CEOs, regardless of the role you might be in, insist on collaborative conversations. Call it soft, not soft, people skills, but collaborative conversations and thoughtful communication. We know that is important. It never hurts to insist on it. Second, perhaps for the boards to have a clear criteria on who to hire so that that match really works, which at the end is the perfect match, right, for things to go and advance and impact performance with the organization and the good of every stakeholder in mind. And then finally, to take the time to travel the personal journey. And I think sometimes we want to reach the end before actually going through the journey. And that's something that the boards can help the CEO advance in the 3 different stages. I thought that was very helpful. But the CEO also needs to know what stage she or he is at in order to, reach the port safely. Thank you very much, Herminia.
Thank you,
Mireia.
Marta.
Thank you.
Mireia.